Well, thank you all for coming. What are you doing? That's a good start.
Okay, sometimes Terry gets upset about the goofy ideas I have when I want to create a new video series, but I've always wanted, inspired by the History Channel, I've always wanted to do something called Drunk Austrian Economics. And I feel like it'll make more sense after a couple shots. So in part, what we're doing today is inspired by that and inspired by all sorts of other crazy things. So cheers, baby.
Cheers. So we'll see how this night goes.
Let's talk some logistics before we get going.
So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about whiskey and how the beautiful things that have happened in the whiskey industry, for the most part, happened as a way around either taxation or regulations. But we feel the only way you can actually talk about whiskey is to drink it. So we're going to be talking about 4 different types of whiskey tonight. We're talking about rye, bourbon, Irish, and Scotch. So we have them set up over there for tastings. So if you want to get up and start with your favorite, it is audience participation. You can keep drinking all the way through the next hour. We'll see how that goes. Matt and I will be doing the same as we're talking about the different whiskeys. This talk started, I'm just going to keep talking while you guys do this. So this talk started 2 years ago. We were in Texas, and some supporters of ours hosted an event where they were screening one of our documentaries on restorative justice called How to Love Your Enemy. And they own a couple venues in town, and they do bourbon tastings. And Jose said, well, in your honor, tomorrow night, we're going to have a bourbon tasting, and you guys get to be the guests of honor. And we're like, wow, that's great. Thank you so much. So we show up at the venue, and there's people set up like with the tastings down in the audience, like where you guys are. And there's a stage, and there's these 2 big Queen Anne chairs, and with the bourbon tasting set up in between them. And Jose says, and so that's where you and Matt are going to be sitting for the tasting. It's like, well, that's kind of awkward. And he then went on to say, and well, tonight is called Bourbon Conversations, so you're going to be talking about bourbon. And so being the professionals that we are, we had 15 minutes to prepare our talk. We went to the bar, did a shot of whiskey, and just went on stage and winged it. So hopefully tonight goes a little bit better than that.
So it wasn't as random as it sounds, because we had been drinking with our friends in Antigua, Guatemala, and we were telling some of these stories that we'd love to tell at Free the People, using something that people care about, in this case whiskey, to talk about things that might matter even more than whiskey, like economics, like the history of government oppression and the unintended consequences of supposedly well-meaning regulations and everything else. So we're talking and talking and talking, and he decided, let's see what happens if you do that on stage.
So most people just think of whiskey as a beautiful drink. We like to think of it as an economics lesson in a bottle.
Well done.
Thank you.
So one of the games we're going to play, if you're participating,
You're going there?
Yeah.
We talked about this.
I know. But I've had a shot, so I'm going to go ahead anyway. One of the things that we do in our family is every time I quote a dead Austrian economist, we take a sip. And I quote a lot of dead economists. And I want to start with a conversation. Am I allowed to start?
You can start.
You sure?
Yeah.
You're going to shut it down?
Maybe.
So one of my favorite economists is a guy named Karl Menger, founder of the Austrian School of Economics. And one of the most important ideas he came up with was an understanding of money as something that spontaneously evolved from people figuring out how to move from barter to efficient system of trading one thing for another thing. And what he discovered is that people liked to use something that they found of value, usually a commodity. And from that, he made the argument that was then picked up by Ludwig von Mises, who also happens to be a dead economist, and Friedrich Hayek, who also happens to be a, you guys aren't sipping. The entire Austrian understanding of how people figure out money. People give money value. People protect the value of money so that exchanges and contracts are meaningful in the process of voluntary cooperation. It had nothing to do with government. It never did. Government comes along at some point and tries to implement from the top down money, which leads me, obviously, to rye whiskey.
So the history of whiskey goes way back, obviously, in our country. The first known whiskey distilling was around 1750. It was brought over by the Irish and the Scots, my ancestors, so I'm proud of that. Prior to that, people had been drinking rum. It was brought in from the Caribbean, or it was made from the molasses that was being brought in. But then during the Revolutionary War, it became harder and harder and more difficult to get the molasses, to get the Caribbean rum. So Americans being...
Because government.
Because government. So Americans being the brilliant people that we are, we started brewing our own whiskey. But it was started using mostly rye, which is what this first one that we're tasting, Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, which is made in Baltimore. So as our country started on the East Coast, so did distilling. And rye grew very well on the East Coast. And whiskey's easy. It's grain and water distilled. I mean, there's not a whole lot there. It's pretty easy. So that everyone always used what they had available to them, and so the colonists used rye.
As David Ricardo once said...
Is he dead?
He's so dead. There's this thing called comparative advantage, which is a fancy way of saying, do what you got, do good with what you got, and make beautiful things out of whatever you have. And Americans, particularly from Maryland to Pennsylvania, which at the time was the western frontier of the United States, they grew a lot of rye. So they didn't use barley like they were using in Scotland and Ireland. They didn't use corn as people in Kentucky would start bringing into that mix.
You're getting ahead of yourself.
Am I?
Yes.
Okay.
We're still in Maryland.
I know.
Okay.
Okay. So what's my point? What's my point, dude? So this beautiful thing's happening. The British has shut off the supply of rum to the United States. Americans, being very American, said, well, screw you, we're going to make our own stuff. And they started making rye whiskey. And about that time, there was this thing called the Constitution. And the first president of the United States was sworn into office. And his Treasury Secretary, feel free to hiss when I say his name, Alexander Hamilton, he thought, remember the entire deal around the Constitution was that the federal government was going to subsume the debts of all the colonies and compile that under a new federal system. Alexander Hamilton wanted to finance that debt with a first government central bank, which he ended up doing. And that in and of itself, this is why Thomas Jefferson was so pissed off at the Constitutional Convention, because it was a huge transfer of wealth to northern states who by and large had much more debt that suddenly became federal debt. I don't know if any of this sounds familiar to things we're dealing with today, but it was the basis by which the founding happened, and they needed money.
It was basically the first Wall Street bailout, if you want to put it in terms like that, and they needed money. And so what is the one thing that everybody in the United States has in common at that point? Whiskey. I think at that point, 1 in 6 homes had a distillery. There were much larger distilleries on the East Coast, right? That was where the big guys were, the big companies were. So Hamilton came up with this brilliant idea to tax whiskey. And the way they set it up was there was 2 ways that you could pay your whiskey tax. You could pay a flat rate, or you could pay it by the gallon. So it was really easy for the big guys to pay a flat rate, which was much cheaper by the gallon, but the little guys, little distillers in Pennsylvania, and they weren't even to Ohio yet, just mostly in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, my hometown, again, another point of pride for me. They were just doing very small batches. Their distilleries, their stills weren't running very much, so they couldn't pay this flat rate. They didn't have the money, so they had to pay it by the gallon, which turned out to be a lot more expensive. So once again, the big guys are getting it easy, and the government's sticking it to the small entrepreneurs.
So to take it a bit further, as you got out into the rural areas all the way to Pennsylvania, distilling wasn't a hobby. It wasn't something you did to get drunk, although there was probably some of that. It was a way for farmers to take a perishable asset, grains, and turn it into a liquid asset, no pun intended.
That's our retirement plan, by the way.
Yeah, our retirement's in liquid assets, except we keep drinking them. But it became a store of value. It became a way in the West that people could use it as currency. So what Alexander Hamilton did was de facto an income tax. People in the West were getting paid with whiskey because it was that means of exchange that Carl Menger talked about. So not only did we have our first tax on whiskey, not only did we have our first national sales tax effectively, it was an income tax. So the takeaway here is George Washington gets sworn into office in 1989. The whiskey tax gets passed in, did I say that totally wrong? 1789, and the whiskey tax gets passed in 1791. We lost the entire republic in 2 years.
Well, the other part of that's interesting, it wasn't called a whiskey tax. It was a distilled spirits tax, I think. But at the time, President Washington made hard cider because he had large orchards. And not surprisingly, hard cider was exempted from this spirits tax. So you think that all of the shenanigans that happen in DC are new? They started from day one.
So the feds came in. You can imagine farmers in Pennsylvania were not happy with this. They were getting screwed. The fat cats in New York and the Eastern distillers had carved out sweetheart deals. So they fought back. And the end of the republic was when Washington rolled in federal troops and shut it down. A moment of silence for the loss of the republic. But on a happier note, rye whiskey is awesome.
Did you mention that it started in Pittsburgh, the Whiskey Rebellion?
My wife was born genetically predisposed to fight the government.
If you're ever, so Whiskey Rebellion started in Pittsburgh, and if you ever are in Pittsburgh, there's a great new distillery there called Weigel, or Wiggle, I think Weigel sounds better, that's named after one of the original guys, one of the original distillers that rose up against the federal government and refused to pay his taxes.
I believe he tarred and feathered the tax collector.
That is a true statement.
Which doesn't sound fun.
No. So as a result of this tax and trying to evade taxes, there's so much more that we could get into. Like if you were found guilty of tax evasion, you had to show up in person, not in your local court. You had to go all the way to Philadelphia. And back in the day, that was not an easy task. They just made it more and more difficult for people to comply, which as libertarians, we're okay with that. But what happened as a result of this is that people were moving further and further away from the seat of power, further and further away from the tax collectors. And so fortuitously, they ended up in Kentucky, where they had beautiful water, which is important to make your whiskeys with, and also they grew corn more so than rye, and so the shift from rye whiskey to bourbon in Kentucky started.
And it happens that it's very difficult to find distillers in the mountains of Kentucky.
So if you haven't gone to Kentucky yet, feel free to go over.
So just some amateur tasting notes. Terry and I, in our family, we have this argument when I'm making Manhattans. She prefers bourbon, which you will see as much sweeter. I prefer rye. Who has the rye right now? Please try the rye if you're interested, because rye, because it's made of rye, is quite spicy. And this particular rye has the mash bill, which is the combination of grains they use to make it. It has more corn than you would have in Pittsburgh, because the whiskey from Pittsburgh and the women are the spiciest in the world.
I didn't see that one coming.
I just sort of made that up on the fly. But who likes the rye? All right.
Who likes the bourbon? All right.
Well, I haven't even tried the bourbon yet.
So my path to bourbon drinking started on Valentine's Day, what year?
It would have been 2014,
2014.
Maybe?
Matt was president of Freedom Works at the time, and he was in a struggle against just the administrative state. There were some big guys trying to take him out. It's a long story. We're not going to get into it. But we were boarding a plane to fly down to Charleston, South Carolina. He was giving a talk the next day, and we had this vision of this romantic Valentine's Day dinner at our favorite restaurant in Charleston. Well, I should have known better, because I've been married to him for a long time, and plans never work out the way we expect them to. So
They're better. They're always better.
Really?
Yeah. Always.
After I tell this story, we'll poll the audience again. So we're getting on the plane, and Matt picks up his phone and answers it, which he doesn't usually do, because in our line of work, you don't want to take a call from someone you don't necessarily want to talk to. And in this case, it was David Korn from Mother Jones, with what he thought was the story of the century about what was going on at Freedom Works. Matt famously said, "I don't know what the F you're talking about," and hung up on him. So by the time we got to Charleston, the shit had hit the fan, and there was all sorts of things happening. So we spent Valentine's Day, I spent it at the bar at the restaurant, and he spent it dealing with this business crisis. And so the bartender took pity on me, because I was sitting there by myself on Valentine's Day, and she asked me if I liked whiskey, and I said no, and she said, "Well, that's too bad, because you really look like you could use one." And I'm like, "Yes, true." And she said, "Try this, try Angel's Envy." And so this was my gateway bourbon. And what sets this apart is that it is aged in sherry barrels, so it gives it a much sweeter, port wine barrels. See, I've been drinking already. So it gives it a sweeter finish. So this was my way to ease into bourbon drinking. And now I am one of those few women that like to drink whiskey, probably more than anything else, against every single stereotype that there is out there.
So I feel obligated to talk some economics here for a second, because Angel's Envy, I believe, is the first bourbon to use a technique that's quite typical in Scotland to finish a whiskey. So bourbon is made in freshly toasted oak barrels, and the color comes from the toasting, and the flavor also comes from the sweetness of the corn. And finishing in a port barrel would be more typical of a Scotch whiskey. And I think that's cultural appropriation. It might be some version of Adam Smith's idea of free trade, because was it him or Bastiat that said, when port barrels cross borders to finish bourbon, troops don't? I don't know, someone correct me on that. Somebody said that. Terry's like, "What the fuck are you doing?" But we mentioned that because of the Whiskey Rebellion and because of the natural attempts, the instincts of Americans to avoid this oppressive tax regime from the US government, a lot of people fled to the hills, and they came up with illegal stills in the hills of Kentucky and Appalachia. Fast forward to this horrible idea called Prohibition, the war on alcohol. Interestingly enough, Kentucky was one of the first states to embrace Prohibition. They did it before the feds did it, but they also happened to have a long tradition of not really giving a damn what the government said. So there's a lot of sweet whiskey coming out of Kentucky, where the bourbon culture comes from.
So Prohibition was clearly a very bad thing.
That was a beautiful handoff right there.
Yeah, it was. You forgot what you were going to say, right?
What was I supposed to say?
I don't know. So Prohibition was supposed to curb people's drinking, right? Like that was the whole movement. Alcohol was bad, alcohol was evil, people were drinking too much, so we're going to ban it so that people stop. So what happened? People drank more. It used to be you would go out to dinner, you would have a glass of wine, you would have a cocktail, but you couldn't do that anymore, so you had to go to speakeasies, and so it was the start of binge drinking. Again, an incredible negative externality, is that the right economics phrase?
Yeah, unintended
consequence. So that was one of the things that happened as a result of Prohibition. The other thing that is possibly the most evil thing, well, one of the many evil things that our government has done, is that they started purposefully poisoning moonshine to try to just get back at the people that were drinking illegally. They were killing people off or causing them to go blind just because they were drinking and breaking the rules.
The feds had a program where they would explicitly poison with wood alcohol. It was actually industrial alcohol because people were stealing it and repurposing it for speakeasies. And it's fascinating to trace the history of Prohibition and this idea that we're going to poison you to death to keep you safe. Does that sound familiar at all? Any modern examples of this might be happening? And you Google this article, and there's one in Vanity Fair, and there's another one in the Daily Beast. This is a fairly recent story, but it turns out that the feds did not believe that this was to prevent people from being bad. They understood that they were killing people, and they killed about 10,000 people by poisoning the liquor, but they were going to poison them into safety. And there was this whole thing, like Prohibition grew out of the progressive movement, and that elitism, that idea that somebody knows better than you how to live your life, what to put in your body in this case. But all of those things, it was just a fundamentally evil way of thinking about the world. And obviously, even if the government isn't poisoning you on purpose, the war on alcohol or the war on drugs or the war on COVID or the war on poverty, we do lots of wars, right? There's always these wicked unintended consequences that hurt people, and we struggle to tell that story, but we're telling it today while drinking a bourbon.
I mean, even today in Indonesia, they're trying to ban alcohol, and it's incredibly difficult to get it. And we personally know people that have gone blind from drinking alcohol there, because to buy legal alcohol is so expensive because it's taxed so high that people go to the black markets, and it's blinding people and killing people today. But we're not going to end the talk on Prohibition on such a downer note, because there was actually one good thing that came out of Prohibition. So you had the guys that were running whiskey, right? They had to learn how to drive really fast to get away from the police. They had to modify their cars. They took out the back seats, they took out the floorboards, they made the engines faster so that they could outrun the cops, and that became the start of NASCAR. So the very first guys that won NASCAR were former bootleg runners, which I think is just phenomenal. And I'm wondering why we don't go to more NASCAR races just for that.
I feel like instead of going to a NASCAR race, we should drive really fast through the mountains of Appalachia, just see what happens.
That's a really bad idea.
So a question for the audience. Who has the bourbon? Anybody? Who likes the bourbon better than the rye? And who likes the rye better? See, you guys are free staters right here. Super spicy. Terry, you're in the minority.
That's okay. I mean, I'm a woman that likes to drink bourbon, so I'm used to it.
Yeah.
So, just as an aside story, I as I said, I like to drink bourbon, so I'll go to a bar, whether I'm waiting for him or by myself when I'm traveling, and I generally will order a bourbon. I'll ask for the whiskey list to see what they have. And I can't tell you how many times the guy sitting to my right or my left looks at me and said, "Have you had a bad day?" It's like, no, I just like bourbon. Or if I'm feeling extra spicy, I'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry, was I supposed to order a Pinot Grigio? Would that make you feel better?"
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Any Austrian economic scholars in the audience? I believe it was Eugene von Boerk who said,
Wow, you're digging deep.
Liberty chicks are fucking badass. We could just end it there.
No, we're going to go to Ireland now.
But we drink whiskey, don't we?
We do drink whiskey. So now we're going to go to Ireland, again, celebrating my family's roots.
I highly recommend if you don't have one, get one of the Redbreast. This whiskey might change your life. Terry's like, why did you interrupt me?
Because now I forgot what I was going to say.
We went to
Ireland. We went to Ireland. The Irish. I love the Irish. So in 1785, the Brits implemented yet another malt tax. So malt is simply grain that has been soaked in water so that it sprouts. And then if that's allowed to happen, there's more sugar involved. And so in the distilling process, a malted barley or a malted wheat or malted grain will provide more sugar, which helps with the distilling, fermentation process. But malt is also used for a lot of other things. I mean, people will use malt for just nutritional purposes and things like that, but it's used in whiskey, so everyone likes to tax whiskey. So in 1785 was the fourth or fifth malt tax that the Brits had imposed in 1644, and at the time, Ireland was importing a lot of malted barley from the UK. And the Irish don't like to spend money. The Irish really like to be thrifty.
You are Irish, and that is not true.
There's always an exception to the rule.
You're definitely thrifty. I have a lot of words for you, but not that one.
Anyway, so leading up to this tax, the Irish had started playing around with the mash bill for their whiskeys, and they had started making their whiskeys with a little bit less malted barley. And then when the Brits implemented this new tax, they said, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to pay that tax. So basically, as a result of that tax, the mash bill, where it is 30% unmalted barley, became not really a rule, but the standard for Irish whiskey, which is why it is so different from Scotch. So Irish whiskey is just creamy and smooth and a lovely drink. And we learned all of this and much more because Matt, being the romantic guy that he is, took me to Ireland for one of our wedding anniversaries so that we could learn how to drink Irish whiskey, because we believe in empirical study. And if you're going to do something, you need to do it right. So if you're going to learn about Irish whiskey, you go to Dingle, Ireland, you go to Dick Mack's pub, which had just been named the best Irish whiskey pub in the world, and you spend a few days there studying very, very diligently. But on our way, we had stopped at Middleton Distillers, which makes Redbreast, and it was there that the bartender told us why Irish whiskey is like it is, and it's because of tax evasion for all, you know.
But by the way, 9 times out of 10, when your Irish bartender tells you something, it's mostly true.
Kind of like this talk.
And he told the story that we just retold, and we have fact-checked him since then, but he was explaining, because I had been drinking Scotch at that point and lots of bourbon, but there's something very different about Irish whiskey. It's so smooth, and I call it buttery. I don't think that's probably a technically accurate term. And this one getting back to, I feel like there's a dead economist coming up soon.
I have a dead economist quote for Redbreast.
Well, bring it on.
Adam Smith actually talked about, and I'm not going to attempt to quote him properly, but he did talk about the fact that Irish whiskey has less malt in it than Scotch.
That's actually true.
Why are you surprised?
So by the way, Redbreast, this used to be an affordable kind of a rail whiskey that you could get at any proper Irish pub. It has doubled, maybe tripled in cost over the last couple of years, which is sort of tragic. There probably should be a regulation against that, but I'm not going to say that. But this particular one, this is not standard Redbreast. This one is finished in sherry casks from the Lustau winery. Do you call it sherry? Sherry is a wine, so it's a winery, I guess.
A sherry?
But this has been finished in a traditional way that you would have Scotch, where it's aged in barrels and then transferred to a sherry barrel to give it that special fruitiness that you taste in that. What do you guys think of this particular Irish whiskey? Anybody in? Anybody not in? Does anyone hate this whiskey?
Get out if you do. Just get out if you don't like it.
By the way, if you hate any of these whiskeys, the only way to get past it is practice. They taste better, I promise.
So the next year, for our wedding anniversary, we went to Scotland. Because if you start in Ireland, you have to go to Scotland. And Scotland, we actually had I had a business reason for being there. Just as an aside, I was working for a foundation that was supporting the restoration of Adam Smith's drink. His final home in Edinburgh, Scotland. So it was a very cool project for me to work on. And it gave us a business reason to go to Scotland so that we could learn about Scotch.
So, Scotch is more complicated to understand because there's 1,000 different interpretations, and we happen to have chosen probably the most extreme interpretation of Scotch whiskey.
No, there's that other one that tastes like you're licking the
The
bottom of an
Octomore.
ashtray.
Okay, who drinks Scotch? Who likes peaty Scotch?
Who likes really, really, really,
Melt
really?
your face. Yeah, there we go. Anarcho-capitalist in the room. I gotta move to this.
So Lefroy was Matt's father's Scotch, and Matt and I have been together forever. And when we were dating and when we were first married, at the time Matt didn't like whiskey. I'm throwing you under the bus here. He couldn't drink it. It was too much for him. And so I would actually go for walks in the evenings with his dad and drink Lefroy while Matt was sipping a beer.
I did dumb things when I was a kid. Does anyone have this story where you bought the cheapest liquor possible and drank too much of it? I don't think I liked whiskey until I was 35 plus.
40
Plus.
plus.
But I started, I'm a beer guy, maybe some of you guys know this, and I'm also someone that's attracted to pure, extreme propositions of a principle.
Wait, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I noticed some of you all don't have a shot glass in your hand. So there's plenty to try. Please, feel free. Because if you don't drink it, we all have to finish it before we leave Porkfest, and
You really got to try the Lefroy, even if you hate it, but it matters to me, personally. What was I saying? Oh, so when I started drinking
you like
beer,
extreme things.
when I started drinking beer, because I was attracted to extreme things, I kept going bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the point where you're drinking a beer that clocks in at 17% alcohol, you're sort of at the door to whiskey. So when you pursue Scotch whiskey, you might start with something like Macallan, something that's very rich, very very drinkable, A lot of lowland Scotch are quite light in style and very drinkable. But when you get to the island of Islay, all bets are off. It's crazy, smoky, and this one is. They say it's medicinal. I think that's generous. It's just crazy. Like you have to sort of learn to like this stuff.
That's mine.
Where's mine?
It's right there.
Okay. But quoting a dead economist, I'm going back to Ricardo, who talked about comparative advantage. The reason that this whiskey tastes like it does is because the island of Islay has bogs, which have been fancified to be reinterpreted as peat. And peat is this soggy stuff that they carve out of the countryside. And for centuries, it was the fuel that kept them warm in the very cold winters in Islay. And they also used it to roast the malted barley. Remember, malted barley is sprouting of the barley. You have to stop that process, so they malt it, they roast it, but they're roasting it with this incredibly smoky substance that they always used. And they did it because that's what they had. They had no options. But today, if you know like real Scotch heads, people that obsess about these things, the escalation war to find the peatiest whiskey that melts your face, it's kind of ridiculous, and I'm all in on it.
Is that Octomore?
Yeah, Octomore is arguably the most peaty Scotch.
It is truly like licking the bottom of a cigar ashtray.
Anyone had Octomore? Yeah, it's good. It's good shit, right?
So I'm going to talk tax policy for a second.
Okay.
Sorry to bring you all down, but we do need to get back to economics. So there's a lot of different Scotch regions within Scotland. I mean, there's the lowlands, which is the areas around Edinburgh, and then you get into the Highlands, and then you get to Islay and the Isle of Skye, which is a whole other story. So again, whiskey is taxed, right? A lot. But luckily, tax collectors are also government employees, so they are lazy. And they were all based in Edinburgh. And when they had to collect taxes, they weren't going to go very far because it was too much work. So they concentrated their efforts on tax collection within the lowlands and kind of ignored the folks in the Highlands and the Isle of Skye. And I don't even know if they were making Scotch on Skye or Islay at the time. But as a result, the distilleries that were in the Highlands were paying less taxes because unless a taxman came and knocked on your door, you weren't going to voluntarily give them money, right? Like, that's crazy. So the Highland distillers had more capital that they were able to then reinvest in their distilleries, which is why to this day that Highland whiskeys tend to be of higher quality than lowland whiskeys.
Believe it or not, there was a ban on the production of whiskey on the island of Islay in, I believe, the late 1700s. So what do you imagine that the people on Islay did? They're like, screw you, I'm gonna go rogue. I'm gonna produce it anyway. And much like Appalachia in the United States, Islay became this place where all of the fishermen became drug runners. Whiskey runners.
Whiskey runners, not drug runners.
I say drug with an endearing interpretation of the word.
I honestly don't know where to go with that.
We're recording this too. But you see the cycle over and over again. We're going to try to bring it to a close somehow, but you see this.
I have a way.
Can I talk first?
Sure.
Over and over again, you see innovative people trying to create something beautiful, and the government trying to oppress them and regulate them and tax them and ban them outright every step of the way. But somehow here we are, and these whiskeys would not exist had people been more resilient than faceless, gray-suited lazy-ass bureaucrats.
All right, your closing was better than mine. But you were talking about the folks that were basically bootleggers and moonshiners in Scotland. And someone yesterday asked me the question that I thought was really interesting, which was, where is it legal to be your own distillery in the United States? And it turns out that the answer is nowhere. Just like drug policy, at the federal level, it is illegal to have a distillery for your own personal use. There are 10 states that will allow it on the state level, so kind of like legalizing marijuana. At the state level, there's a couple places that do allow it. Not New Hampshire. And remember, New Hampshire has these state liquor stores, which is a ridiculous way to sell and distribute liquor. In New England, it's Maine, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts gets it right. Like, they don't get anything right, but they do get this correct.
So I want to close by talking about why we're up here sitting in front of a cooler getting sort of shit-faced.
Speak for yourself. I'm perfectly sober.
Well, I'm older than you are. Hey. But what we do at Free the People is we try to figure out a way to tell a story that's engaging to people, that might get them turned on to all the values that we've been talking about here at Freedom Fest. And as an economist who loves all those dead guys that I quoted, I came to the ugly realization that nobody thinks the way I do, nobody cares about the way I think about things, and instead, like, come up with some sort of emotional connection so that they can be like, oh, I didn't know that's why that whiskey tasted that way. I didn't know why beer suddenly emerged as this awesome thing after they legalized homebrewing in the United States. So there's a way to teach about tax policy and regulatory policy and the awful omnipotent power of the state by just telling a story. And that's what we try to do. And the other thing I discovered is that a couple years ago I started giving talks with Terry, and people like her a lot more than like me.
We also discovered that people think that we're much better public speakers if we have you all drinking. So that is actually our secret that we just told 100 plus people. So you all thought you were coming here to have a fun conversation about whiskey and maybe drinking some, but did you think you were going to learn tax policy?
They love tax policy.
This is the wrong crowd to ask the next question. Would you have shown up if it said Tax Policy 101? Woo! So as Matt said, we specialize in storytelling, and one of the most recent documentaries that we made that I'm very proud of is a story called...
The Free Life?
No.
All We Have?
Eric.
Oh, what is that called? Closed indefinitely, shut down indefinitely.
Something along...
Yeah.
Really? We can't figure that out.
Who's that?
That was my very subtle timer to say we have to wrap it up. So anyway, we made
guys,
this great documentary.
What's that doc called?
That neither of us...
Where's our guys?
Our team is here.
Joel, what is it called?
Oh, no, that's the one in Brooklyn.
The one about Eric in D.C.
All right.
We've all been drinking. Don't worry about it.
I'll talk about All We Have instead. So All We Have is another great documentary that we made, and it tells the story of a bar/restaurant called the Schnitzel House in Brooklyn. And it is a heartbreaking story about what they went through during the COVID lockdowns. Their struggles that they had in keeping their business open, keeping their employees paid, but they also, right before the lockdown, their adult son started having grand mal seizures. And he wasn't able to get the care that he needed because he didn't have COVID, and the government bureaucrats had decided that if you don't have COVID, you don't get to go to the hospital. So he died during the lockdowns because he couldn't get the care that he needed. So we made this heartbreaking, heart-wrenching story that I still tear up when I talk about. But we never mentioned Cuomo. We never mentioned how badly government sucks. It was just this heartbreaking story. and it got accepted into a number of film festivals across the country, including a couple in New York. And it was shown in person in New York once they allowed people to actually go to the theater. But it also won Best COVID Film in the state of New York when it was just a searing takedown of the overreach of government. And that's what I'm so proud about. Our team is here. We've got Miguel, who's the new guy on our team.
Say hi to the new guy.
Say hi to the new guy. We have Logan over there. We have Joel manning the bar.
Logan on sound.
Sam Martin in the back. And that's all that we have
So
here.
these guys, maybe some of you have talked to them. We're making a documentary about PorkFest and the Free State Project, which we're just gonna give to the community. So if these weird guys come up to you, go ahead and talk to them. They're super friendly.
They're not nearly as scary as they look, honest.
They're not dangerous. And we also have a series of events happening at our tent site. It's Tent 101.
It's RV Site 101 on Galt's Gulch. So tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we are doing a Kibbe on Liberty interview with Lou Perez. At 4 o'clock, we're doing another interview with David Friedman. Earlier in the afternoon, you probably forgot about this, at like 1 or 1:15, as part of the 101 series, we're doing a how to make cool videos. So you can come and we will tell you all of our secrets. And then on Saturday night, we have the final Free the People happy hour at our site. We have a very good friend named Jim Caruso, who is a great, I can't say he's a great libertarian, because I said that the other day, and it's this crowd, so they're like, really? How great of a libertarian is he? He's a really cool guy, he's a libertarian, and he owns Flying Dog Brewing, and he donated a bunch of beer for us. So please come by on Saturday at 5, and we'll have whiskey to drink as well.
Thank you guys so much.
We have 2 minutes for questions. How's that for timing? Who can ask a question in less than 30 seconds so we can answer it for a minute and a
libertarians
half?
can't do that.
I know, that's why I said it.
I got a funny question.
Uh-oh.
What's your opinion on Glenn Beck's commercial place?
That's a great question.
Oh, so Kibbe on Liberty is co-produced with Blaze TV, which is Glenn Beck's channel. And by the way, it's massive. And myself and Eric July are the token libertarians at Blaze TV. And Eric would say the same thing. Glenn is libertarian curious, and he lets us do whatever we want. And
Is he liberty curious?
I think he is.
I'm flacking our merchandise, by the way.
Yeah. Well, when you do it that way, it's like, yeah, I'm curious. I'm super curious. But
We are never publishing the recording of this talk.
yeah, we'll cut this part off. But I've had a long time relationship with Glenn Beck. I know some libertarians don't like him, but we believe that you need to be talking to the right, you need to be talking to the left, you need to be talking to independents, and you need to be talking, I'm pointing at your boobs right now, to the
Liberty Curious.
Yeah. So Glenn is a fantastic partner, and some people don't believe the fact that he's like, just do what you do. And we're going to have, as a random example, we had the New Hampshire Mises Caucus on, that has not been released yet. We're going to have David Friedman talking about anarcho-capitalism. And we're going to talk about some really cool stuff because I want to expose people that haven't heard about this stuff to new ideas, and I hopefully do it in a way that's thoughtful and not scary and welcoming no matter where you come from.
All right, you're about to get the hook.
Okay, we got the hook. Thank you guys.